When it comes to hills and mountains in the British Isles, perhaps one hill feels more mystical than many others, and that's Glastonbury Tor. Standing some 158 metres high, it's said to be a fairy hill, one of those curiously hollow hills in which fairies made their home. And not just any fairies lived inside Glastonbury Tor. Gwyn ap Nudd, Lord of the Otherworld, was believed to live inside it. But what other legends might we discover about Glastonbury Tor? Well, let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are finishing Folklore of Mountains and Hills month, and we're finishing off with Glastonbury Tor. Now, before we go any further, I just want to say that this week's episode is brought to you by live oak, which means liberty. And if you, like me, didn't know what live oak was, apparently it's a form of evergreen oak, which you particularly get in the United States. So that is what is Sesame Street style sponsoring this week's episode. But like I say, we are bringing Folklore of Mountains and Hills month to a close for now. It has been a little bit of a pain trying to find what to do for this final episode. I did really want to do Helvellyn in the Lake District and I couldn't really find enough to make it worth doing. So that's why we're doing Glastonbury Tor, which is kind of an obvious choice that I just didn't think of earlier. But there we go. Now, I do want to point out before I go any further that I'm not getting into arguments about what archaeology supports what, or which name translation is correct and so on, because if you look at a lot of the journal articles about it, there seems to be a lot of people writing snarky letters to each other and different publications about who got what wrong. That's not really what I'm interested in, because this is a folklore podcast, so we are going to be focused on the legends. And let's be honest, Glastonbury has long been a place of legend, particularly the Abbey. And just as a little bit of a side note, because I think it is interesting to see that legend and lack of evidence do go hand in hand where Glastonbury is concerned, because by the 13th century, legend dictated that 12 disciples of Jesus built Glastonbury Abbey in 63 AD, led by Joseph of Arimathea. But it is also worth noting that the first church on the site wasn't actually built until the 7th century. So it is worth bearing these kind of things in mind. And legend also held that the Abbey was the burial site of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. But like I said, we're not bothered about the Abbey, as interesting as it is. We're not even really hugely that interested in King Arthur, although we will probably come back to him at some point in the future. But instead we're looking at the Tor because we're looking at hills. So that's just to keep that in mind. Now, one of the things that I sort of found quite interesting is I've often heard people talk about Glastonbury as being the site of Avalon. And for a long time I was kind of like, how could it have been an island? Not realising that many, many centuries ago, it was essentially an island in the middle of a marsh. So where the Tor is would have been one of the bits that was actually sticking up and therefore comprised this island. Now, Nick Mann wrote quite a lot about this in a pamphlet in 1986. And he had said that Glastonbury was this island and it was called Innis Wittrin, or the Glass Isle. Now, obviously the marsh is long gone and Glastonbury now stands on the western half of the original island. But visitors who ascend the Tor on an especially misty day do report that the view across the mist on the plains helps them to visualise the Tor as being part of an island. Now, the Tor is probably most recognisable for having the ruined tower, which was once part of a monastery to St Michael, and there is also a possibility that the stepped terrace on the slopes of the hill was actually part of a giant labyrinth. Lots of people have different theories about this, and on one hand people believe that pilgrims were following the labyrinth in order to reach St Michael's Church, and then on the other hand people thought that if you actually followed the labyrinth you would find the gates of Annwn, or the Welsh Otherworld. I don't know one way or the other, I've never been, so I can't really say which one I think is more likely. But it does very much seem man-made, the way that these terraces work. Other people have suggested they may have just simply had an agricultural function, so who knows. But one of the really interesting things about Glastonbury is the rather heavy Christian focus on the Abbey set against the fairy associations of the Tor. Now, the legend of the Fairy Hill actually only dates to the 16th century, and it comes from the life of St Cochan, which is a Welsh text. Now, according to the story, So Cochran settles on the Tor to live the life of a hermit, and apparently there was remains of a hermitage found. One day he's going about his business doing whatever it is that hermits do when he overhears locals talking about Gwyn ap Nudd, who lives on the hill. Or rather, he lives in the hill, with his castle located inside the Tor. Now Cochran hears them chatting about the hill's fabulous fairy powers, and apparently one of the things it was quite famous for is those who went inside for what seemed to them to only be a day and a night might emerge only to find that years had passed in their absence, which is something that we often encounter with stories about fairies. Look at Thomas the Rhymer. Cochran upbraids the locals for talking about fairies and insists that they're actually demons, and the locals then upbraid Cochran in reply, warning him that such language won't endear him to Gwyn. And they're right. So Gwyn obviously finds out about this quite massive slight, and if you think about it, Gwyn is supposed to be the king of the Otherworld, so you are essentially having a go at a local ruler at this point. But anyway, he invites Cochran to meet him at the top of the Tor at midday. Now Cochran actually declines twice before eventually agreeing, although he does take his holy water with him in a flask. Cochran goes to the Tor's summit as requested, where one of Gwyn's men comes to fetch him. He's then taken down into a vast cavern that houses a fine castle filled with a fabulous court, although it's not entirely clear what the light source is inside the cavern. It just seems to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Gwyn's man leads Cochran to Gwyn, who sits on a golden throne. Now Gwyn offers Cochran food and drink, although Cochran refuses, because he points out that actually all the food is really just leaves, but it's been enchanted with a glamour to make it look like a fabulous feast. And if you're at all familiar with fairy folklore, you would also know that that's quite a wise move, because eating fairy food in the other world usually means you're stuck there. Gwyn then draws Cochran's attention to his courtiers, and they're wearing clothing that is red down one side and blue down the other, although there is another version that said the clothing is red and white, which reflects the colours of the Cumanún, the spectral hounds of the Otherworld. Again, Cochran is completely unimpressed and retorts that hell is both flames and ice, referencing a medieval belief about hell's geological makeup. Finally, Cochran sprinkles the holy water around him, and both the castle and its court vanish, and Cochran finds himself standing alone on the hilltop, and he never sees Gwyn again. Jennifer Westwood and Jacqueline Simpson note the common elements of fairy lore in this story. Obviously, other tales have described fairyland as being inside a hill, where fantastical courts are merely an illusion. And we often see this illusory quality in the tales of the fairy midwife, in which a human midwife visits a home that appears to be full of splendour and opulence, only to find it's actually a cave in the middle of nowhere once the glamour is removed, and that's the point at which she actually discovers she's just delivered a fairy baby. And I do have an episode about that for a Northumbrian tale. But what's really interesting with this whole story is the fact that the names come from Welsh lore, and Gwyn ap Nudd is often referred to as a psychopomp in Welsh mythology, although he's also more often entrusted with guarding the entrance to Annwfn. And here he keeps our world and the other world apart. In other tales he does then go on to become the king of the other world, but I do highly recommend Mara Starling's 101 introduction to Gwyn ap Nudd if you want to know more about him. But while other tales bear similar legends to this one, Nick Mann suggests that if earlier peoples had somehow perceived the island of Glastonbury as being the entrance to the otherworld, then it might explain the human activity on the Tor for so many centuries. Now, one set of legends is a lot more difficult to trace in terms of origin, and these are the ones that claim that there is either a tunnel connecting the Tor and the Abbey, and we all know how much I love a good tunnel story, and I agree with Bethan from Erie, Essex on this one. There's also the story of a hollow cavern inside the Tor. Now, this one doesn't appear to actually be linked necessarily to the other world, but there we go. But there's also the legend of a druidic temple beneath the Tor. Now, the idea of a hollow Tor, obviously, like I said, links with the stories of Gwyn ap Nudd and Annwn, but it also possibly explains the tales of people who somehow disappeared into the Tor, and on those occasions, if they did return, because not everyone did, they did so having been driven mad. And as one example, 30 monks apparently found a tunnel just open up in front of them while they were chanting in the abbey. They chose to enter and found themselves heading towards the Tor inside this tunnel. No one knows what really happened to them, but only 3 returned. One had been rendered mute, while the other 2 were mad, so they couldn't actually explain what they had seen. And this one's quite interesting, how it links the idea of a hollow Tor where strange things happen to people, plus the idea of a tunnel between the abbey and the Tor. Another version of this story actually sees the Tor maze recast as a processional route that originally disappeared into a tunnel that then continued the labyrinth inside the Tor, but it's less clear whether this was a labyrinth that would take you to Annwn or whether it was actually still part of the religious aspect of the site. Now, Nick Mann makes the point that it's likely that there are hollow spaces within the Tor created by the springs that tumble through the rock, and Cave has even reached some of these subterranean chambers in the early 1980s. So while it's unlikely that the Tor is hollow in the sense that it's like a pudding basin type hollow, there will be pockets of space within the Tor. So the story isn't entirely wrong, it's just what's actually in those hollow spaces that then basically begs the question of what's under the Tor. The idea of the Druidic temple is a little bit more difficult to unpick, and it's a bit more unclear to see where that one came from. And the idea of there being a tunnel to the Abbey, like, no evidence of that has been found. But you do find this with a lot of things. Whenever there's two major sites, there's nearly always some kind of tunnel supposedly connecting them for whatever reason. Now, I did say that we would briefly come back to King Arthur, because he is more often linked with Glastonbury Abbey, or indeed the idea of Glastonbury as a whole, since it was said to be the island of Avalon where he was taken to have Morgan Le Fay heal his wounds. But there is a link between King Arthur and the Tor. Now, these links do appear to come from monks writing in the 12th and 13th centuries, which also mark the first written references to the Tor. Now, Garadoc of Llangarvan wrote Life of Gildas in the mid-12th century, connecting King Arthur with Glastonbury. And it seemed the local King Melwas had a stronghold on the Tor, and he held Guinevere captive there. Only the intervention of Gildas helps to secure Guinevere's release. Now, there may have been a seed of truth behind this legend, since archaeological excavations do suggest the presence of a military site in the late 5th or early 6th century. So we do have to wonder, did the ruins inspire these legends of Arthur, especially since he was already linked with the place? But we'll probably never know. But finally, there was one other fascinating aspect of the Tor that I did think we should consider. Now, John Mitchell noticed an alignment of ancient sites in southwest Britain in 1969, and Glastonbury Tor aligns actually quite perfectly with this line that also stretches into the Avebury Henge and St Michael's Mount. Now, given the sheer number of churches or hills along the line dedicated to St Michael, it became known as the St Michael Line. As Mann points out, the 27 degrees northeast alignment along the Tor also has astronomical implications, because it indicates sunrise as the start of May and August. And what that basically means is the sun is expected to rise over the Tor on the 1st of May and the 1st of August when viewed from Boroughbridge Mump, which is also on the St Michael Line. Obviously, regular listeners will know this anyway, but the 1st of May marks Beltane, while the beginning of August marks Lammas. Not necessarily exactly the 1st, sometimes it's the 2nd of August, but it's like that kind of time of year. Mann notes the importance of these dates to the Celts, although I would say we should always take care assigning dates given the changing of the calendar. And just as a slight side issue, this always fascinates me when people are like, oh yes, this specific date in August was really important to the Celts. And I'm like, well, no, it would have been that time of year that would have been important to the Celts because the calendar has changed at least once. So just bear that in mind. But in the late 1960s, Professor Alexander Thom found the remains of standing stones on the Tor. Now, these stones apparently supported the solar alignment in May and August. Sadly, only the two that mark the entrance to the maze still exist on the St Michael Line alignment, but they do offer a tantalising glimpse into a legend based on topography and linked with one of the archangels, no less. So what exactly do we make of these legends of Glastonbury? Well, I think that because of the link with King Arthur, there was always going to be some kind of fascination with the legendary status of the place, but I find it particularly interesting that we then have these links with the Welsh Otherworld as well. And obviously remember that the King Arthur stories do have their origin in Welsh stories as well. So I do think that because of the part of the country that it's in, you can see where this Welsh influence would come from. And it really makes quite a nice change that the King of Fairy himself pops up as guarding this entrance to the Otherworld underneath this Tor, which otherwise seems to have quite a lot of important implications whenever people have actually done research into the historical aspects of the area. As I said at the beginning, I didn't want to get drawn into a lot of the historical and archaeological debates because I think the legends themselves are quite interesting. And it's the fact that they do reference legends that we have in other parts of the British Isles. So, for example, the idea of somebody going into a fairy space and then emerging and finding that years have passed, that occurs in lots of other places as well, and also not just with the story of Thomas the Rhymer. There are other tales that have that same element as well. The idea that time moves very, very differently in the Otherworld than it does here. Then we've got the idea of Cochan not taking the fairy food and drink, which again you find in other stories that if you eat something when you're there, you're stuck there, which in a lot of ways also references things like the Persephone myth as well. This idea of the glamour is also really quite important. The fact that Cochan can then almost exercise all of this with his holy water makes you wonder, does he actually make the court vanish, or does he simply somehow cut through the illusion so that he was actually always on the top of the Tor and never went inside the cavern, but such was Gwyn's magic, he could make it look like he was actually inside a castle inside the Tor. Again, we'll never know. But I would love to know what you think. Do you like these kind of tales of King Arthur? Do you like the tales of fairy legends? And so I'm definitely finding fairies a lot more interesting the more that I'm looking into them, and I'm loving seeing these different elements that appear in legends from other parts of the British Isles as well. If you've ever been to Glastonbury, please feel free to let me know what it's like. I've never actually been. It is one of those places I probably should go to, but it's such a pain to try and get to from Newcastle that one of these days I'll go, although when that'll be, I don't know. You'll notice I've not mentioned either of the wells in this episode, but we will return to those at some point when I do some more water folklore in the past, because they're not really connected with the Tor sufficiently to put them in this episode. I felt they would work better elsewhere. But I hope you've enjoyed the folklore of Mountains and Hills month. As I say, we'll probably will come back and revisit them in the future, because obviously we've got the likes of the Peak District that we've not even looked at. There's Ben Nevis, there's Snowdonia, there's all these different places. There's the Alps and so on. But I will be having a look at an aspect of Alpine folklore as the bonus episode this month. So if you're a Patreon supporter at the £3.50 a month or higher tier, you will then be getting that particular Alpine folklore episode. Next month, I was trying to decide what on earth to do for December, and I thought, I'm thinking it's December, it's Christmas, that means ghosts. Ooh, Christmas ghosts, that means Dickens. Ooh, Dickens means London. That was literally my thought process. So we're going to be having a look at some London ghost stories specifically for the first 3 weeks of December. I've got a very, very special episode coming for you for Christmas Eve. So it'll be the day before, so it's Christmas Eve. But that's coming, and I haven't quite decided what I'm doing for New Year's Eve, I guess it would be. But just bear in mind that we're going to be doing ghosts and so on for December, because, it's not really Christmas without ghosts as far as I'm concerned. So there we go. Anyway, so like I say, there's Alpine folklore if you're a Patreon supporter, and there's a ridiculous number of episodes. I can't remember how many now, but it's well over 45 episodes now, which are obviously a lot longer than these ones a lot of the time if you choose to become a supporter, and then that obviously also helps me to keep Fabulous Folklore going. I hope you've enjoyed this month, and I'll see you next month when we start getting into some London ghost stories. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.